I jumped.
All right. It's showtime. Okay, so we're going to begin the Nantucket Conservation Commission meeting for Wednesday, July 17th. I'd like to remind everybody that if you have a cell phone, please turn it off or put it on silent. This meeting is being recorded. We ask that if you're recording, to please let us know. Commissioner Maureen Phillips is on the phone tonight. Hi, yes. Maureen, you can hear us? Okay.
I can hear you fine, Ashley.
Okay. And we're going to begin with public meeting, public comment. Okay, so we'll move on to the public hearing, notices of intent. We have Town of Nantucket, Jetties Beach Playground, the end of Jefferson Avenue, and Children's Beach.
Sure, so just to update this, we've been waiting for the natural heritage determination, and they sent it to us today, and they have 4 conditions that they'd like us to include. One is a time of year restriction unless there's a qualified shorebird monitor. They'd like a beach management plan, which is fine, and then they're authorizing this for 5 years for their determination. So they're really just looking at the time of year restriction. So with that, I think we have all of the information that we needed to finish that one off.
Okay.
Motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have to go by voice vote.
Oh, that's right.
So Phillips?
Yeah, well, is this the one that I didn't think I could vote on this because I wasn't there for the earlier meeting?
No, we've only heard it
right?
the one time.
No, we only heard it once.
Oh, okay, all right. No, I'm in favor.
Okay, Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye. Steinmauer, aye.
Okay, so that carries unanimously. Okay, moving on to A&B Realty Trust, 14 and 20 Shakamo Road.
For the applicant, Casparo, Nantucket Engineering, and Julie Jordan, Drive Design Company, is also present. And this is the second hearing. I've provided a letter and revised plan based on input that from the commission at the first meeting. So I'd like to just briefly run through the updates that I made to the plan. First and foremost, shown in the red line to clarify, is the 100-foot buffer zone, which is essentially the jurisdictional limit of the property. So even though we've been looking at show the whole property and there's work outside your jurisdiction, and then the green line is the 25-foot buffer zone, and the blue line is varies between border and vegetated wetland boundary and coastal bank, depending on which is the most restrictive or most furthest upland, if you would. And we clarified in the letter that there would be no mechanical mowing past the 25, no meadow establishment past the 25, past the green line, and that any work in that area would be done by hand in terms of invasive species control only, and primarily the target species is bush honeysuckle. And I also clarified in the letter, or we reduced the scope of the project to remove that work within the salt marsh resource area and the BVW resource area, and to not try to target phragmites at this time. So it's really trying to look at the resource area that we would work in would be a portion of land subject coastal storm flowage and a portion of the coastal bank and then the buffer zones. So we've tried to simplify the project and then to focus really on the buffers and then the areas outside of the buffer, which is jurisdictional for some piece of it for natural heritage, which is the green line with the dashed with the long and short dashes, and again, most of that is to the south, and a majority of the property is actually not jurisdictional. I received, as did the sign off from Natural Heritage yesterday for the work, so we took care of that. In the letter, I also stated the discussion that we had had. I tried to memorialize in the letter with respect to the caliber of trees, that there wouldn't be any trees removed that were greater than 4-inch caliper within the buffer zone. Though one item that we didn't discuss that I put in the letter was I would ask that you would accept pine trees, which I would think is you would typically, you know, agree with the removal of pine tree, you know, the pine trees that you know, could be removed is what we would ask for. Now, if you had a reason to leave that, we wouldn't want to hang up the application, but we don't really see those as beneficial species within that area. And I think that covered everything that I had in the letter. And again, that would only be, you know, that limitation would be within the 25 to 50. And of course, we agreed to provide, we would monitor, check the site twice a year. We would provide annual reports with photographs reporting what was done. And we're not really anticipating much in terms of herbicide or fertilizer use, but as one member had stated, some of the, if we encounter some really large bush honeysuckle, those would be the only ones, and we would do those with a licensed applicator, subject to best, you know, management practices, and provide reporting on that. But we don't really think that's going to be the extensive method of control here. We're really looking to pull out as much as we can. And with that, I'd be happy to try to address any outstanding questions or concerns that you may have.
Any questions from the commission?
Yeah, I have one question. Do you happen to know what species of pine you have on the site?
I think it's Regina.
Okay, yeah, so the one concern I have over that is pitch pine rigida that you guys are talking about is a known roost area for northern long-eared bat on Nantucket, which is an endangered species. So I see benefit to leaving those trees. There's going to be a, if we go the other way and we allow you to cut, there's going to be a June and July restriction federal anyway, so the work couldn't commence in those 2 months.
I think a time of year restriction would be perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
We would accept that as a condition.
Are there a lot of pitch pines in there, or
There's a couple stands.
Yeah,
in the
but
area.
they're actually, mostly it's the hillsides that have really, you know, this piece of property hasn't been left to its own devices for very long, so you find that the honeysuckles are all pretty small and they're on the banks. And then at the top, you do have some stands of rigida, you know, in a couple of different areas.
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of pitch pine on the island. There's going to be, it's outside of, it's going to be above our jurisdiction. There's going to be that limit of work for June and July cutting anyway.
Yeah.
So we can condition that, but it's going to get conditioned essentially by the federal government that you can't do that anyway, so.
We would agree with it, just to simplify and have a double restriction, if you will, that would be fine.
So we'll condition no June and July work
Yep, we can do that through
on the pines, yeah.
through the orders.
I guess my feeling is the pines should probably remain, like, if they're within the 50, certainly.
Okay.
So maybe to only no pines, so only between the 50 and 100.
Yeah, I mean, the pitch pine I do see as valuable habitat. You know, the black pine certainly could go. But I think we're getting rid of more pitch pine than we should be locally, and it would probably enhance the habitat value here.
That's fine as a condition as well. We're not looking to overly complicate anything, but I think there are areas that were some that would be for the establishment of the other, what we had discussed on site and had in mind. I think that, you know, sort of no removal of the pitch pine within the 50-foot buffer zone would also be an acceptable condition.
Any other concerns?
And if I may, excuse me, we also included in the correspondence the list of species from the, I included the brochure from the Biodiversity Initiative, so that would be what we would essentially pick from, which had been the, you know, I know I had said originally application native species, but I understood the commission wanted a little more information, so I hope that helps to narrow it and meets that concern.
Well, like I said, this piece of property is already telling all the signs about who wants to be where, and the only invader really is the bush honeysuckle, so.
Any questions from the public? Jeff, do we have everything we need to close?
We do on this one.
Okay. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second,
All in favor, Phillips?
yes.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
Okay, that carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to James M. Goddick, 40 Squam Road.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Brian Madden from LEC Environmental, representing the applicant, James Goddick. The proposed project involves the construction of a pool house, garage, and related appurtenances. 40 Shakamo Road, 40 Squam Road. The wetland boundaries have been previously approved under a determination of applicability issued back in 2016. That determination also authorized some brush cutting, which has taken place, and I submitted some photographs of the existing conditions. The proposed structures themselves are located outside the 50-foot buffer zone, and there's been some proposed regrading on the property to increase separation to high groundwater. High groundwater has been designated at, or established based on observation at elevation 9.4. The garage is going to be on slab, so it's going to be well above the 2 feet. The proposed pool house is going to be on a crawl space. Now that will also be outside of the 2-foot separation on groundwater. And the pool is going to be 6 feet deep, so that will bring the bottom of the pool elevation right above high groundwater. But we don't have that 2 feet of clearance, so we are requesting a waiver, putting no adverse impact on that front. And the pool will be surrounded by a small fringing bluestone patio. On this one, no pool fence is proposed using the automatic cover. And the roof runoff from the pool house and garage are being redirected to subsurface infiltration systems on the between the structures and the roadway. And that's essentially the extent of the work.
I have a question, Brian. This
Yeah.
is Maureen Phillips.
Right.
In the written submission, that you were looking for a waiver for the 2-foot separation, both from the pool and pool house. And did you just say that the pool house crawl space does not need a waiver, or it still does?
Correct.
I thought you said it was.
Sorry. Yes, we submitted revised plans on Friday that added more fill to increase that separation. So it's
Okay.
only the pool that currently doesn't have the 2 feet of separation.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions?
Is there gonna be a trail, a path or something for people to walk down there, or will the road be the access?
No, the brush cut path will remain. There's a sewer force main that will extend up to the existing septic system. That brush cut does exist. It's just going to be, there's some stepping stones and a walking path once you get close to the structure. And actually, there is some proposed infill of native vegetation. Thinking something like bayberry, highbush blueberry, arrowwood. I think the intent there is to give it some privacy, separate the two developed areas.
Is this gonna be like a driveway point here?
Not a formal driveway is being proposed. That is going to be the construction access and will be left open.
Okay.
Right now, there's no formal improvements there.
Okay. I guess I'm just thinking it probably needs to stay open just because if the pool needs to be drained or have a truck
Yeah, it'll be left open. I'm assuming it'll just be lawn.
Okay.
This is Maureen Phillips again, and I'm just wondering, since we've got this problem with the 2-foot separation for the pool, and looking at, you know, protecting the resource area, and, you know, that this, to give a waiver, it's got to be something that is, you know, kind of going to put things on a the area will be better off for it. I guess I'm just not seeing, and my fellow commissioners, please comment if I'm off base on this, what is because this is an older lot and maybe wasn't, you know, would have been, you know, otherwise put together, but putting in a 6-foot deep pool, yes, I mean, it could have been deeper, but, you know, I'm not sure why we have to have a pool at all in that area where you don't have the proper separation for that entire part of the pool. Plus, we're going to have a concrete slab for the garage, and you know, and further cover with the pool cabana, which is I guess 1,000 square feet. So there's a lot of you know, currently, you know, open ground that's going to be covered, and I'm especially concerned about the pool. I mean, the 2-foot separation, you know, has a purpose, and I'm just, you know, I'm having trouble seeing why this should be granted a waiver when this isn't a septic system. It's not, you know, pools and pool houses aren't, to my mind, and, you know, critical items. So, so you know, that's just reading it myself. That's what I saw. So, I'd be very interested in hearing for comments both from the applicant and from my fellow commissioners.
Yeah, I mean, Maureen, I do have to agree with you. I have trouble waivering pools. So I see your point there.
I do also think we might be having a regulatory update about pools going on in the near future. And
We'll see later.
Yeah, we can't.
we will we'll see.
Pertain to
But we
this.
commonly provide,
Yeah.
historically provide a separation for pools.
Yeah, and just for clarification, the waiver that we're seeking is not for an improvement to the resource areas or buffers. It's for no adverse impact and no reasonable alternatives. In the NOI application, we did discuss how, you know, deeper pools were dismissed. We wanted to keep this with the revised plans now being able to get it above groundwater. And, you know, the functions and values that you're looking at here are you know, flood control and storage, and groundwater discharge and recharge. You know, we are proposing the roof runoff being treated and managed, and, you know, with this abutting swamp, such a large system, and we are, you know, we're not getting into groundwater. You know, we feel that, you know, the interests are being protected associated with the project. And I don't know if you wanted to color in some history.
Squam Road and projects along Squam Road provide the basis historically for the adoption of this waiver from the 2-foot groundwater offset. About a dozen years ago, there just happened to be a number of projects along Squam Road at about the same time, and they were pumping groundwater out of their excavations, and with the relatively impermeable soils in the Squam area, it was making a mess. So the commission adopted a waiver requirement, and the reason for it, which is not contained within the regulations, but really the reason for it is for provisions to be provided in the case of encountering groundwater. Is there a location on the site to excavate a temporary holding area so that sedimentation is not running into resource areas or into public areas? So I just wanted to give you a little bit of, I know there's new members on the board and everybody else may already know that, but I mean, there's a historical perspective and a reason for the waiver requirement, and if we address, you know, how we're going to deal with that in that case. As David pointed out, the commission has historically granted this waiver.
Yeah, and again, I look at it as if you're not even tapping into groundwater, then you're not even, you know, and you're mitigating stormwater runoff accordingly. You're not even getting into a situation where you're, you know, adversely impacting the functions and values of flood storage, capacity, flood control, and recharge, which are, you know, when you're talking about waiver to groundwater, those are.
Any questions from the public?
RJ Turcott, Nantucket Land Council. So, do you have any idea exactly how much dewatering is going to be necessary for this project?
Well, at this point in time, with the through the chair, with the pool being above high groundwater, depending upon the time of year that you're actually installing the pool, you may not have to do any dewatering whatsoever. If there's a need, you know, just at the very top of high groundwater, that will be directed to dirt bags outside within the limit of work, but encircled by hay bales as typically required. So it'd be very minimal, I would suspect, if any.
If dewatering is in fact necessary for this project, I believe it should be done outside Concom jurisdiction. There's a lot of sensitive areas, as the commission is well aware, especially Squam Swamp, and also just neighboring properties in general. As far as
I'm sorry, I missed. I'm sorry who's ever speaking, but
yes.
but you cut out for a minute. There's about Concom jurisdiction. What were you saying?
Right, that the dewatering should occur outside
I'm sorry.
the commission's jurisdiction.
Okay.
Did you hear it? You got me there?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
As far as the pool goes itself, the waiver is being requested under section 1.03 F3A, citing no reasonable alternatives, but as Commissioner Phillips mentioned, this is not a failing septic system, this is not public infrastructure, it's essentially a luxury item, and it could very well have adverse impacts on the sensitive areas surrounding it. As I said, Swamp is one of the largest wetland systems on the entire island of Nantucket. And lastly, the pool house, I don't know if we could find out from the Board of Health what the existing capacity of the septic system on the property currently is, and do we know how much this pool house is actually going to add to that septic system, and whether that's permissible as well.
My understanding, there's no need for a septic upgrade.
The current capacity of the septic system is for 4 bedrooms, so the dwelling on the property would take up 3 of those, and the Board of Health and Building Department assigns 1 bedroom of flow capacity to like a pool house with a bathroom and a water closet in it, so that would meet the 4 bedroom limit on the septic system.
Okay, thank you.
Just a comment, with all respect, I understand concern about pools and about, you know, crowding things on lots, but it has never been really in our purview to judge whether something is needed or not needed, or if it's luxury, or if it's, right, you know, whatever it is, it's about, does it fit in the regulations? I mean, there are cases where we have made, you know, some exceptions, you know, like for septics or things that are needed. But, you know, we can't deny a project because, well, we think there's too many pools on the island already and there's an ocean right there. What the heck, you know? That's not in our regulations to decide if it's needed or not, or what's the justification.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we were getting into groundwater, I think
Yeah, that'd be a different story.
conversation.
You are willing to pump out to a truck if you need to do
All
water.
typical requirements, we would expect that.
I do have a question for the applicant based on the time of year you expect the work to commence. I saw from National Heritage that they had a condition in there about Northern Harrier
Yes.
take. And being
Yeah.
someone
There's
with a
exactly the opposite in the application.
being someone with a background in avian ecology, I looked at the dates for when they said nesting season for harrier was, and in Nantucket it goes a little bit later. I was wondering if you might be willing to adopt March 1st through August 31st rather than July 31st.
Only if, so, I mean, I think as long as those conditions apply and just extending that timeline.
Yeah.
Because the way it reads is,
Commence, yeah.
yeah, as long as work is continuous.
Exactly.
And,
But yeah, I mean, just today in mid-July, I saw harrier fledgling activity, still very active, nests and things like that.
yeah, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yeah, just in the commence, not that no work can happen, just the same with the added month in.
Any other questions? Okay.
So my name is Rick Atherton, and I'm not in a butter, but our house is at 48 Squam Road, so we're like 3 lots up. I just became aware of the project and the submission today, so I haven't had a chance to fully review and comment, but a couple of quick observations. I am aware that a number of abutters and neighbors have expressed concerns as I've talked to them, but they're just not prepared. And I think one thing, this is an intensely developed portion of one lot. It's almost like a second dwelling with the size of the pool house. And I think I would ask that you hold the hearing open for at least one more commission meeting to give others a chance to comment on the project. I don't know all the rules about fill, but when I hear we're filling a lot in order to meet separation requirements, I start to say, well, I guess we could fill 6 inches or 10 feet. And how do we deal with that? And if we allow fill to meet a project's requirements here, maybe we can do it everywhere. So I think that's a real issue. I think some of the other things on the plan are just a little intent on that end of the lot. There's a garage, and usually with a garage you have an access to a road, and that may not be your question, but I think it would be a question for another board, because that would be a second curb cut in effect. I'd like to have an opportunity to supply pictures of Squam Road that I take 3 or 4 years ago when the road flooded. And I think there are issues with the swamp and drainage and how the pool is going to be managed under those circumstances. When the Squam Road was impassable for several weeks. Since then, the road has been graded and raised, so it's mostly passable. We haven't been flooded. But waters do come up to the same level they came to before. And I think you needed to have a chance at least to look at those, because those same waters back up around this very lot, all the way down around here, around to where the new construction is. And you ought to have a feel for the scope of that flooding that does occur. I don't know how that impacts your requirements or your approvals, but I think it would be helpful for you to see those. I think those are my initial questions about this, and I think I did notice, or is the pool actually within the 50 feet by a foot or something, or maybe not now? It's awfully close, and I would hope under the circumstances you don't have to give waivers for anything. A project can be designed not to require waivers. Waivers are usually applied for by the applicant because they benefit the applicant, not necessarily the resource area. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Brian, would you be willing to keep this open 2 more weeks, or do you want to close?
I mean, we've notified abutters. I haven't heard from anyone who has contacted our office. I think we got back most slips.
You have heard from another member of the Squab Road community, but not a direct abutter today by email.
Correct. We received an email about 2 p.m. today I actually just brought it up when we started talking about it. And it's from Howard Blitman, who is someone who just commented and been living in that area and been registered engineer for 50 years, he said, and he wanted to express his sentiment of non-approval for this intended construction. To build a pool, house, pool patio, garage, sewage disposal, and accessories at this site will certainly affect the Squam Swamp and water going into Squam Pond. And that's from Howard Blitman. Howard Blitman, B-L-I-T-M-A-N.
Well, I will say, because the notice still needs to be filed by Natural Heritage, we still need that response. They reviewed a prior project under MISA, but we still are awaiting comments under the WPA.
Okay, so you have to wait it over.
Keep it over, guys.
Okay.
That settles that.
I will say, just for the record, they did meet all of the correct notice requirements, so it wasn't that they didn't or didn't do it as they
Immediate abutters have been all known.
correct. So the way our abutter notification works, just for everyone to know, is anyone that lives within 100 feet of the property that the application is related to, so just kind of a 100-foot buffer zone on the whole parcel. If any part of that line intersects with your property, whether it's the whole property or just nicks an inch of your property, the assessor provides you a certified list that you have to mail that certified mail return receipt, noticing people of that meeting. So that's the receipts that we get back and that can review.
Maybe I just say, there's no issue with the abutter notification. I mean, no complaint on our end.
Yeah,
I'm not an abutter, I wouldn't be notified, I found out from other ways. But I do think it's an interesting lot because it's strangely configured, and that's why I think you have a lot of issues before you today. But I just wanted to make that clear. And one other thing, the wetlands boundary, sometimes the commission asks for an independent review of that boundary. I don't know if that happened when it was established a couple of years ago. You may not feel it's necessary. I know that in some cases that does happen. It's an important part of this project to be sure that boundary is properly configured given the closeness to the wetlands. I mean, you go off the back of this property, it's all wet.
So we did review originally that the request for determination of that boundary and agree with it, and have since re-verified that line. So I think we're comfortable with where that line is located.
And also just something to point out, the topography does ascend west of the pool, so it does go up before it starts dropping down again. And, you know, even some of the grading is going up too.
So would you like to continue for 2 weeks?
Please.
Okay, so that continues until
7/31.
July 31st.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to MLR3 LLC, 45 Shakamo Road.
Gotta give Brian a second to switch plans.
Brian Madden from LEC Environmental, representing the applicant. Proposed activity before you is to permit some brush cutting on this vacant lot. It's a 10-acre lot. Resource areas on the property that were flagged this spring. There's an isolated vegetated wetland that minimally encroaches onto the southwesterly corner lot. There's a small isolated wetland somewhat centrally located, and then in the northwesterly portion there's another isolated area that minimally encroaches on site as well. North of Shakmo Road is BVW, extends or transitions the salt marsh up to Shimo Pond, and by definition there's a coastal bank that effectively abuts or becomes somewhat close to the traveled way for Shakmo Road, and that area is highlighted. Absent of that coastal bank, we'd be looking at an RDA for this brush cutting work. But because in order to access the site from Shakmo Road to the east, I don't know if folks went down there at all, but I submitted some photographs. The traveled way does have some overhanging vegetation, so we are proposing to do some limited pruning, only to allow for a vehicle to drive down the road and into the site. We're not talking removal of any shrubs or trees, just pruning back to clear a path along the traveled way. No additional improvements to that. And then the brush cutting is just to open it up, basically for marketing purposes. No formal work is proposed at this time, no improvements, no driveway or fill or anything like that. And the majority of the vegetation is shrub vegetation, mix of bayberry, wood, scrub oak. Probably, what you see right here, it's going to be a lot less than that. But in order to keep a cumulative review with natural heritage, we have to show the full potential limit of work. And I just highlighted the areas in the buffer zone that are being cleared. So it's relatively straightforward. And again, we do need a waiver request for the minimal pruning to get into the site, basically at the entrance and a little bit along the edge of Shakmo Road. But it's just minimal brush cutting and pruning within the commission's jurisdiction.
So Brian, just be brush cut, no soil disturbance?
No grubbing, just a quick brush cut.
And the vehicular access, you're not proposing to widen it at all? Just prune it?
Okay. Clean back some overhangs.
Yeah.
Some low riders.
Are you willing to leave like any big trees you see? It looks like there's big cedars in the pictures.
I mean, brush cutters don't go after the trees, and when they try to keep it simple, but if you want to put a condition in there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially since there's no plan for a house or anything at this time, leaving those would be the best.
And again, I think probably what will end up being brush cutting is very minimal. I mean, basically they just want to get to the high point.
See what they have.
So this is a good point, because Brian said it pretty quickly, is in sites like this where the whole thing is mapped habitat, that there's anti-segmentation provisions that kind of go with that and kind of keeping a cumulative review. So Heritage just often looks for establishing what that total work area would be if you were to kind of continue through the project to the end. So that's why a lot of times we see projects like this that come in and are showing a much larger area because it's within mapped habitat, and they don't want to run into that kind of anti-segmentation provision that the Heritage puts forward. So it's something that we don't often see it, but they have to show it, because if then they do it later, they can run afoul of that. So Brian just said it really fast. It's all right.
Right, any other questions from the commission? Public? Are you waiting for Heritage on this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so continue for 2 weeks. All right, so this continues until July 31st.
I will ask.
So we'll have a condition for no tree cutting. Is that correct?
Yeah, and would you guys want an order for this from the next meeting?
Yeah.
Too?
Yeah.
Okay.
That'd be great.
And are we gonna go with the same 4-inch DBH we've been going with recently?
No tree cutting.
Or no tree cutting at all?
None at all.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we said it a little bit. I think having a dimensional measurement is helpful, because that way if you're out in the field and someone is trying to hem and haw whether it's a tree or a shrub or what's going on, if you give it an actual measurement, it kind of ends debate.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
4 inches seems to be pretty. I don't think
that's
of,
fine. On
You're
Nantucket, we
bringing-
have tree species that grow as shrubs, so
Yeah.
I think the dimensions
well,
make
they-
sense.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
and I don't think that any brush cutters out here are going to go after really anything that's bigger than 4 inches,
Yeah, yeah, no.
4.5 feet off the
Yeah,
ground.
we
That's
have
a
some
bold
crazies
choice.
out here.
We do, but that would be pushing it. So
Even a brush hog or a bobcat wants to stay
Right.
away from that.
Okay, so that continues for 2 weeks, and we're moving on to Gisela Leinhard, 11 Jonathan Way.
It's a 2-sheeter. People want to see it. Sheets.
Yeah,
The site plans on the top.
Too far.
You go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. Jeff Blackwell for the applicant. This is a vacant lot at the end of Jonathan Way in Town Nevers. The lot was created in 1971, prior to the adoption or promulgation of the State Wetlands Protection Act, and of course the Nantucket Wetland Regulations. The property has been owned by the same family ever since 1971, and they are finally thinking of building. So there's a bordering vegetated wetland right in the middle of the lot, and so that is dictating the location of the proposed dwelling and the septic system. A waiver is requested for the septic system because it is not possible to achieve a 100-foot setback between the vegetated wetland and any place on the property. So the septic system, which is a raised mounted system, is located right up along Jonathan Way and as far away from the wetland as possible. There are two elements to the waiver, of course, as we've been discussing on other projects. I'm here to demonstrate that there's no adverse impact, and there's no place on the property where the septic system can be placed, so there's no reasonable alternative. The page right after my waiver request is a detail taken from the Horsley, Whitten, Hegeman 1990 groundwater mapping study, which shows that groundwater in this area is flowing southerly, basically from the leach field toward Jonathan Way, and as such, any nitrates or bacteria that survives the enhanced treatment process will be carried not toward the wetland, but actually away from the vegetated wetland. We are including microfast IA system as part of this septic system, which is just one more step to assure that there is no adverse impact to the septic system. And then, as I said, there's no reasonable alternative because the alternative is the lot would be deemed unbuildable, which is, I don't believe, reasonable by anyone's reckoning. There are no other waivers for the property. We meet the 50-foot no structure setback and the 50%, we exceed the 50% no disturb between the 25 and 50-foot setbacks. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address those.
Questions from the commission?
Jeff, will this be a year-round or a seasonal dwelling?
I would guess it's a seasonal dwelling because Gisela lives in New York City now, and she has for many years. She's, a retiring doctor, which may mean that she's going to spend more time on Nantucket, but there's no way for me to be sure about that.
I was just wondering about, sometimes at seasonal dwellings, we permit tight tanks. in situations where there's not, you know, other options available.
The Board of Health and the DEP consider tight tanks to be solutions of last resort. The problem with tight tanks is they require constant human participation in their function, which is basically just to pump them out. Whereas any other sort of septic system is relatively autonomous. So that would not be a permit that we could require.
Okay.
Question, is the house getting waivered for separation of groundwater as well?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it is. That is the second element of waiver that we requested. And similar to previous discussion, if you know, if dewatering is required, there's plenty of room on the property, and the soils are, in this case, unlike Squam, the soils testing revealed that they're just very sandy soils. So a temporary retention basin and infiltration basin can be created to re-infiltrate any groundwater that's pumped and prevent any sedimentation toward the wetlands.
Has the Board of Health approved this?
Yes, they have. In fact, I brought the permit, which was just issued today. Here to see it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm only one shot, actually.
That's okay.
Yeah,
We can share.
I'm gonna send it down to you, Ashley.
Doesn't really say much, it just says it's
I mean, I have to say, I am uncomfortable with waivering a septic that's not like an old septic that was in failure, for a property that both the house and the septic need waivers for.
I feel the same way. I understand that this property predates the Wetlands Protection Act and the local bylaw, but I don't think this is a type of project that we would normally permit.
Yeah, I share your, this is Maureen, I share that concern. You know, we do have all over the island lots that were laid out, you know, before the regulations came in. And, you know, it is quite literally a slippery slope about how you issue waivers for regulations that are clearly there for a purpose. And a piece of land is now, you know, would be allowed to be buildable, but isn't because, you know, it was put together before the regs existed. So my worry is that, you know, allowing waivers in this kind of situation really kind of guts the separation requirement.
Well, I would respond by saying that the Board of Health has issued a permit. I feel that I've demonstrated that there is no adverse impact to the placement of this leach field on the property due to groundwater flow direction and because of the incorporation of enhanced treatment to the septic system. I feel that I would need specific questions to be presented to me to address your concerns in order for this to go forward. I mean, I'm not getting a specific question, so if you have those, I'd be happy to either respond to the meeting tonight or ask for a continuance to develop that information. But these are exactly the sorts of waivers that have been granted routinely by this commission in the past, so I mean, there's an element of precedent here too, I think.
Questions from the public?
R.J. Turcotte, Nantucket Land Council. The first thing I'm going to reference is a water quality report from 2018 from the Nantucket Land Council. If any of the commissioners would like to take a look at this, feel free. But Tom Never's Pond has some of the highest phosphorus levels measured in any Nantucket Island ponds since the Land Council began monitoring in 2009. There's a couple of reasons for this. First and foremost is the cranberry bogs to the north. When they flood them, all of that water comes down Phillips Run and into Tom Never's Pond, as well as the golf course, which is also to the north. The applicant intends to install an IA system with microfast, which obviously, as they mentioned, increases denitrification significantly, but this is a freshwater system and limiting nutrient is phosphorus, and that equipment does not address phosphorus. So we believe that the added nutrients into the system will have adverse effects. If groundwater is in fact flowing southeast, that is going toward the wetlands surrounding Tom Never's Pond, unless I'm not looking at the maps correctly. And lastly, as far as precedents go, in 2012, an almost identical project was brought before the Conservation Commission, and it was located on 46 Walnut Road, and it was denied on similar grounds as well. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Through the chair, if I could respond. Tom Never's Pond is located off to the east a good distance, so it is actually much further away from this septic system and not in the groundwater flow direction. So that there would be no contributing factor from the septic system toward Tom Never's Pond or the adjoining wetlands around it.
Is there another question from the public?
Ma'am, did you want to?
Can you come up and speak into the microphone?
I don't have a specific question. I'm concerned by it, and I appreciate the need your name, please.
Yeah.
Sorry?
We need your name
for the record.
My name is Claire Sequist. We live at 10 Jonathan Way.
Thank you. Okay. No other questions from the commission?
Can I make a couple points just for clarity's sake? One, just really quickly for RJ, if you could send us a copy of the report. Since you referenced it in your comments, I'll have to add it to the record. So I won't steal your highlighted copy here. Or perfect. I'll just keep that one then to add to the record. Just a reminder to everybody that if you present something as part of information in testimony, we need to keep a copy for the record. So I'm happy to wait a day for it if it's your only copy, but we need to get a copy. So just wanted to run through a couple pieces for clarity purposes related. I'll kind of work backwards. The 46 Walwinet Road filing that was denied, I just want to, for clarity, that was a permit that was issued a split permit. So that was a project that was compliant under the state act. So the state requires leach fields to be outside of 50 feet from those wetlands, and at the time they did. So that was able to gain a positive permit under the state act, and the denial for that permit was solely through the local bylaw. So that was, there's two orders of conditions on that property, one for the DEP file number, and then there's an NAN number for the other one. So it wasn't a total one way or the other, but that was eventually upheld through appeal and then kind of carried forward. So the other part, and it applies to one of the last ones too, I just wanted to remind everybody, and especially since Seth and Maureen are new, the way our grandfathering works is our definition of grandfathering revolves around the use and normal maintenance of any structure or alteration of land. So it has to be an actual existing use of the property itself, because the lot lines were drawn at a certain point, doesn't grant your uses that would have been available to that property at the time to be grandfathered. You actually have to be doing it. And the case I give is we have lots of lots on Nantucket that are very, very old that don't necessarily get what the zoning state was or wetland state was at the time that it was created in 1890. It runs by current regulations for development. So that's how our grandfathering functions. And then the last one I just wanted to touch on briefly, and I was going to say it in one of our earlier filings, it's something that we often lose track of when we kind of shorten that waiver requirement for no adverse impact, no reasonable alternative. But there's a very important kind of qualifier to that reasonable alternative, and that's no reasonable alternative that allows the project to proceed in compliance with the regulations. So sometimes it's well, you don't have to do it. Well, that's not necessarily the alternative that they're looking to be contemplated. So whether or not there's areas available on a lot or some other alternative to be explored to get some sort of alternative analysis why things aren't available would be something that would typically be asked for in involvement with that. Obviously not doing the project is clearly an alternative, and has obviously what the choices are there, but that's not contemplated by the regulations. But I just wanted to try to get all that back out there because we don't see all this stuff that often.
Thank you.
I apologize for the speaker buzz. I don't know why it's buzzing tonight. It's coming from the speaker. Yeah. No, they do too. Everyone's been buzzing out of the speaker tonight, so I think the speaker just has an issue.
Awesome.
At least they're working.
So I'd like to ask for a continuance. I'd like to review the 46 Walnut Road denial, and I would ask that if you have any questions that I could, whose answers I could develop between now and the next meeting, I would ask if you have those.
Can you come back with something showing where Tornato's Pond is in relation to this system? Because I'm not sure. I don't have my screen with me, and I don't know what this shows.
I would say we're also waiting for natural heritage on this lot as well.
Okay.
So
It looks like 0.1 mile to the east, but that was a cursory look.
Yeah.
And Jeff, if you could provide the documentation for that groundwater flow.
Yeah.
Okay. Above and beyond the Hageman mapping, because I did include a section of that map.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good then.
Very good.
it looks like a contour map, but it just shows groundwater flow direction. You just see these really bold contours that come through. But I will confirm that it is in the information.
Very good. Is there anything else?
Excuse me, are you talking about, did you mention, this is Maureen again, a groundwater mapping that was from 1990? Is this what you're discussing, or am I mixing that up with an earlier thing? What's the date of that groundwater map?
Jeff Blackwell, that's 1990. That mapping was commissioned by the Nantucket Land Council and adopted by the Nantucket Board of Health in 1990.
So I'm just wondering, I don't know if this is proper to raise here, but is it likely that is still valid? That given how things have been changing otherwise. I mean, I do not know the answer to this, but is that old a finding still likely to be valid today?
I can take that one if you want me to.
Does anybody know?
So I'll answer that for you, Maureen. This is Jeff Carlson, not Jeff Blackwell.
Thanks, Jeff.
So right now the Horsley-Witten maps are the regulatory standard that the Board of Health uses for groundwater mapping and groundwater flow direction. We've been talking a lot in the town about doing an update because I think everyone kind of agrees that mapping that was done kind of through the late 80s and the maps drawn. The date of the map is specifically January of 1990. Is probably something that needs to be updated island-wide because it's just old. I can't believe I'm saying something from 1990 is old, but it is. So, but right now that mapping is the the legal standard that the Board of Health uses to evaluate groundwater flow direction. So for any residential drinking water well or irrigation well that comes in, when you see that recharge zone and that flow direction for that 200-foot buffer zone, it's typically based upon that Horsley-Witten map.
Okay, so I guess then as one commissioner, I would say I really think that needs to get done sooner rather than later, because as we have more people wanting to build on lots would otherwise, you know, where they need waivers, I think we need to have much more, you know, accurate timing before because something that gets built today, if we do a new groundwater survey and it turns out that things are not as good as we thought, you know, someone's built a permanent dwelling and you know, and the land suffers. So I think it's very important if we can push on our fellow members of town government to get that done. So thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it.
No problem. I think everyone would tend to agree with you that keeping those things up to date and doing those is probably something that'd be nice to do.
Okay, so you'd like to continue for 2 weeks?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this continues until July 31st.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
And we're moving into public meeting minor modifications. Norris at 31 Pilgrim Road.
Thank you. For the applicant, Paul Santos with Nantucket Surveyors. The applicant being Mark and Elizabeth Norris. They are the owners of a property located at 31 Pilgrim Road, in which this commission issued an order of conditions in May of 2018 for work that was strictly buffer zone, which involved the construction of a small section of a pool and a stone patio, fire pit, and stone wall within the 100-foot buffer zone to a vegetated wetland. The land itself had already been graded and was already vegetated at the time this application came before you. The application before you is a minor modification request, and it sets forth 2 modifications to the plan approved by the commission in May of 2018. Specifically, the placement of a post and rail fence along the southeasterly property line abutting the land of the Nantucket Islands Land Bank, and that is located on this property line here. There is now constructed a post and rail fence. As part of the order of conditions, one of the conditions was that the applicant mark the property boundary closest to keep all site work on the locus. And as you can see, what you've got here is you've got a case where the property line is here. There's an existing wetland and a pond to the east, and this post and rail fence at least lets these potential owners of this home know where that line is between the land bank and this property. If you were to go out there when that fence wasn't there, the tendency, I think, is to think that they own down towards down that pond. The other minor modification was along the northerly property line. The plan spec'd a Leyland cypress plantings, and they were privet was actually put in on that section of the property line. The southerly property line privet was spec'd, and that was put in. In this case, the Leyland cypress was replaced with a standard privet. So those are the 2 minor modifications. These are as built. What we are seeking, these came up when we did the as-built plan with an attempt to come before you for a certificate of compliance. I know Jeff and Joanne have both been to the site with regard to their standard inspection for a certificate of compliance application. And if you'll notice, I think later in your agenda, this certificate of compliance is actually on the agenda. What we're looking to do is basically validate the post and rail fence and the change from Leyland cypress to the privet. And be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions? Nope. Would someone like to make a motion
Move to issue the minor mod.
Is there a second?
Second.
Phillips,
In favor?
Aris, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
Well, that minor mod carries unanimously.
Thank you.
I might say, since we're on the topic and just have it fresh in our minds, do you want to take up the certificate of compliance for the project? Right back to back with it?
Sure.
It's out of order, but
Yeah.
Paul just did such a nice little presentation.
Such a good
went through
segue.
it. And I think if it's helpful that we would say that we obviously had him come in for a minor mod for issues that we thought were a little bit above and beyond substantial compliance, but I think with that being done, I feel comfortable saying that the site's in substantial compliance.
Okay. Is there a motion to issue the cert?
Motion to issue the certificate of compliance.
Is there a second?
Second.
Maureen, are you in favor?
Yes, aye.
Harrisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
Okay, that carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on in certificates of compliance to Town of Nantucket, Hummock Pond Road, Milk Street to Cisco Beach.
So this is one that we've carried over a bit, and it was brought to our attention when it first came in that there were 3 distinct areas of drainage concern that some little washout areas had come through the sand. As of today, and even post-rain, inspecting it today, those 3 areas have been raked out and repaired and reseeded, with some of the sediment that was down below in the actual wetland area removed from that front line without disturbing the vegetation through there. So right now it's in compliance and in repair. I know we had done that through that fixing through the enforcement process because the order is expired. But other than that was kind of the last outstanding issue with that site.
Okay. Is that giant stand of knotweed still there?
So there's a stand of knotweed that's right adjacent to the guardrail that's there. And even looking today and driving further down, there's a couple other stands of knotweed kind of throughout the bike path project area that need to get addressed. And I've talked to Director McNeil about it a few times, and I think the DPW would like to tackle that, but I have tried to encourage him in a couple of those spots that I don't think goats are the answer for those spots. So that is something that they'll be looking to do, but they also understand that treating that knotweed is something that's going to take for a number of the spots and some permitting to do. But trying to encourage and not to get too far off the field. The DPW has been spending the last few months with a separate consultant working on a kind of a general notice of intent for their day-to-day operations that cover a lot of their basic activities, from roadside mowing and sightline clearing to road grading and things that are there, things that take place a lot of times in buffer zones that have always just been considered to be regular maintenance, but having some formalized process for that, and been trying to encourage invasive species treatment and removal within especially these roadway areas for areas that they've done work and disturbed, and stand of knotweed comes back, or a little patch of frag pops in, or you see some bittersweet show up. That's something that could get rolled into that perhaps. So when it came up, it wouldn't be a, hey, you need to do a permit for this little 2-foot square stand of knotweed. Let's just take out the 2-foot square of knotweed. So hopefully that will be included in that application.
Okay.
It's kind of
Thank you.
That would be really good, especially with knotweed along the bike paths. If they could do it as soon as it pops up the
Right.
first year, just
Then they'll
hit
get
it
rid of
and
it.
have
Yeah.
it gone.
Well, there's a few spots. I mean, I think we've seen them. Knotweed is probably the worst on bike paths, but there are definitely a host of invasives that pop up in areas that have been developed, especially through roadway projects and for fill that's brought in. And I know there's even been spots where loose strife has showed up in certain areas, and knotweed and frag and all kinds of other fun things that are easier to get rid of when there's like 2 plants and not 200 plants.
Anytime there's a new stop sign put in,
Oh yeah,
knotweed pops up.
you would think that we would just pre-treat those posts or something.
Yeah.
Just something for the area, but I tend to agree. Any real roadway disturbance is always, you see that little like perfect leafy cover of knotweed that shows up within like a week, and then all of a sudden it's off to the races.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice to just have a program to get that underway and just removed safely and correctly. That's always my big fear with public works, is not just doing it, but making sure that it is done correctly. They tend to be a little bullish in the China shop, so
Just a little.
trying baby steps. They're applying for a general notice of intent at some point, so at least they're headed in a positive direction.
Yeah. All right. Any thoughts on this one? Do you, can RJ speak to this?
Sure.
Okay.
It's up to you.
I'm sorry, Ashley, what did you say? I couldn't quite hear what you just said.
RJ's gonna speak to this project with the
Oh,
land
okay,
council.
okay.
So we have a conservation restriction on that particular property where that work was done on that bank. We're requesting to wait 2 weeks before giving the certificate to see if it's actually going to work, or if it's going to continue being an issue. Because give the certificate, then there's no incentive for DPW to do anything else afterward. Just mostly an issue. We don't know if it's actually going to work or not. It's just happened today, this afternoon, so.
Can we have ongoing conditions with this one that would cover that?
So this is the rub, is the work that was done today wasn't done under the current permit, because the permit is expired. So this was done under kind of enforcement provisions to repair the site. So you certainly don't have to release that, and you can certainly have it within your right if it happens again to order it repaired again. So it's something where we're a little bit in the catches. You can wait, you certainly can, and then go from there. But there's also nothing that would prohibit then in 4 weeks dealing with the situation again, or in 6 weeks, or in 8 weeks. Obviously, anytime that there's damage to a resource area, you guys have the ability to enforce upon that. I mean, demonstrating whether it was willful or one of those things is a different story, but it's something where working under closed permits isn't something that's able, working under expired permits isn't something that's able to be done outside of regular maintenance. So we're a little bit in the gray area where the permit is expired, but hasn't been closed out into regular maintenance phase, and dealing with an enforcement to fix an issue from surface water runoff from the bike path over land and into the resource area. So I guess for mine it's 6 1/2 dozen, but it can be up to you guys.
Okay. Does anyone feel one way or the other?
I just wonder if 2 weeks would be an adequate time period. I mean, if we're going to expect plants to survive, we're usually looking at, you know, a longer period of time.
So I guess I kind of agree with that.
Sure.
I mean, you certainly, if you issue a certificate, you don't give up the right to deal with it later.
Right.
I mean, you're not really
Yeah,
giving up anything. So you still have the ability to say it's not satisfactory, or you've created a worse situation, you need to fix it, and you actually have more leeway, because then you can actually order specific remedies to be done.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as I see it right now, if we close the permit with the certificate of compliance, then we can move forward with formal enforcement later if it was to happen again. But if we don't, we're trying to, you know, enact jurisdictional processes on expired permits, which doesn't really work.
It's not the best situation to be
Yeah,
in.
I think I understand what you're saying, but I think from a jurisdictional framework, we actually have a better standing by closing the permit now and just working it as an enforcement condition if we need to get to that. Hopefully we don't need to get to that, but I personally feel like that's the way to go.
Yeah, I'm fine issuing the certificate.
Second.
I don't think I can be the first. Is there a motion to issue?
Motion issue.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, Maureen?
I guess I.
Okay. Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
That carries unanimously.
The next one's much more simple.
Is that Pocoik? 21 Washing Pond Road.
Yeah, so this is for a project that was for a house relocation. They didn't do it, and the permit has expired. So we're just seeking to invalidate the order of conditions. So that's just essentially that certify that the work regulated by the above referenced order never commenced, the order of conditions has lapsed, and therefore is no longer valid. No future work subject to regulation under the Wetlands Protection Act may commence without a new filing and notice of intent. So that's essentially what we're doing. I don't usually read it, but again, we haven't done that with new turnover. So that would be our recommendation, would be just to accept that invalidation.
Is there a motion?
Move to accept the invalidation.
Second.
All in favor, Maureen?
Aye.
Arisman, aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
That carries unanimously. Okay, so moving on to orders of conditions, we have Town of Nantucket, Jetties Beach Playground, the end of Jefferson Avenue, and Children's Beach road layout.
All right, so I sadly forgot the draft order for this because it's been so long, but we can go through it because I have it on my computer when I find it. Sorry about that. Oh, here. Well, I'm waiting. You guys can pass out the one for 14 and 20 Shakamo. And we'll work on that one in a minute.
That's rare.
Don't complain, Dave. Don't complain.
I'm happy. It's a rarity, but I'm happy.
So originally when we had drafted the findings for the Town of Nantucket ADA walkways, the only condition that we had put on there that we are recommending is kind of mirrored by the heritage comments, that any work between April 15th and August 15th requires a qualified protected species monitor to be present for work on the beach. If no protected species are present, that monitor must provide that in a report to the Natural Resources Department. The dates provided by Heritage, their condition that's the same is essentially to avoid impacts to the coastal breeding species and their habitats, installation of the timber boardwalk shall not occur during the period of April 1st to August 31st unless under direct oversight of a qualified shorebird monitor as determined by the division, implementing a division-approved monitor and protection plan for state-listed shorebirds. So I think we would recommend that we attach these letters with conditions directly to the order so they don't lose track of them. But in that condition to change that any work between April 1st and August 31st. But other than that, we couldn't really think of any specific conditions for those. They seem pretty straightforward.
And they're all in besides the one.
Correct.
Okay.
In that case, I would move to issue as amended.
Second.
Yeah. All in favor? Maureen?
Aye.
Arisman, aye.
Aye.
LaFleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
That carries unanimously. And then we're moving on to orders of conditions for A and B Realty Trust, 14 and 20 Shakamo Road.
So we had asked for this from last time, but there's a couple changes, if everyone has their copy, that I think would be reflective of discussions tonight. Primarily, condition 20 would need to be modified to reflect the discussion. Sorry, I'm trying to get caught up. So I think we recommend from the discussion that condition 20 would be the applicant shall not remove any trees over 4-inch DBH, excepting any invasive species or pine trees outside of the 50-foot setback. So you're exempting them out outside of 50, and then anything inside of 50 would be there. And then we would add a new condition. I would probably bump 21 down because it would make more sense in the flow. So 21 would become 22, and the new 21 would be that no pine trees are to be cut
From June 1st
from
to
June
July
1st.
31st.
Yes.
And for the DBH requirement, inside the 50, we're still requiring that pine trees above a 4-inch DBH remain.
Yes. One second. Before I get back to that, Seth, what were those dates again?
June 1st to July 31st.
So I think we'd have that first one read: the applicant shall not remove any trees over 4-inch DBH, excepting any invasive species or pine trees located outside of the 50-foot setback.
Good.
So if they're inside, they are still have to, if they're over 4 inches, they have to be kept.
Sure.
And I think it makes more sense to bump the other condition down so the 2 pine tree conditions are in a row.
Sure.
Or else it gets weird to skip around.
Is there a motion to approve as amended?
Motion to approve as amended.
Do I have a second? Okay, all in favor? Maureen?
Aye.
Arisman, aye.
Lafleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
That carries unanimously.
Yeah, we didn't close anything else out, so.
No. So we'll be moving on to extension of orders of conditions, Nantucket Conservation Foundation, Medui Creek.
So this is the Medui Creek Phragmites project that they've been working on. They have started the project and are diligently working away, but the permit is getting to the end of its effective life and they haven't gotten through all of their treatment areas yet. So they are asking to extend for the full 3 years to continue doing that invasive species treatment.
Move to extend.
Is there a second?
Second?
All in favor? I guess Maureen?
Aye. Yeah. Aye.
Arisman, aye.
Lafleur, aye.
Engelborg, aye.
Steinmauer, aye.
Okay, that carries unanimously. Moving into other business, approval of minutes from July 3rd and June 17th.
Oh, sorry, go on. I have a quick, just a typo. Somehow Maureen Phillips became Maureen Phillip halfway through the minutes, so just have an S on the end of my name.
You dropped the S, yes.
Yeah, somehow the S got dropped.
Sorry. That's an easy find and replace.
Yeah.
Good.
Any other comments about the minutes?
None.
Okay, so we should approve
Thanks.
by unanimous consent with that one typo?
Yep.
Okay. Good on the minutes. All right, monitoring reports.
Oh, the SPPF minutes, it looks like needs to get approved as well. Or we just
Did we
approve
just-
both?
I think-
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I said that date. Did everybody agree to approve that one as well?
Agree, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Monitoring reports.
None in this week.
So regulation update discussion.
Do you want me to introduce this and all?
If you want
Just
to. Sure.
for the general public here. So the purpose of this agenda item, the chair asked this to be put on the agenda because I think there's been a feeling for a while that the regulations were last updated, I believe, in 2013, that we were well overdue for at least a little review and update and kind of talking about some topics. So the last time we did regulations, we literally sat here and went performance standard by performance standard and talked about them, and it was really pretty brutal. So I think the way, instead of having the public hearing for it tonight, was have an agenda item and then have a bit of a brainstorming session for areas to be addressed or looked into. And then after that list was kind of formulated, letting staff and the public get information in for the commission to review, and then maybe get some instructions for what they're looking for drafting materials, advertise the public hearing, and then review kind of an informed draft of what those changes may look like, and try to take care of it that way and be a little bit more efficient and make sure that changes or suggestions or areas were well informed and discussed and vetted before they went into regulations. But that's, I think, was kind of the intent.
Yeah, I would agree. And then to possibly have special meetings this fall in order to discuss it thoroughly
I think that needs
to happen.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great idea, because I think, you know, having looked at those last few years, we certainly, you know, some of the you know, the fines or penalties or fee. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that just could stand a little cleanup and perhaps made more enforceable. You know, just have a clear standards for that. So I think that's a great idea.
Times are changing, more clarity. Will help.
Yeah.
Reviewing some and then trying to set forward some
Yes.
other issues.
I mean, I know I'd like to look into like what qualifies as a structure and how we can, you know, possibly change some of that language.
In general, or in coastal bank situations, or?
In general, just because I think some of our like bluestone patios aren't as impervious as they're, you know, or as pervious, excuse me, as they're supposed to be, and they cause a great deal of runoff, yet we allow them.
Keep allowing them
Yeah.
as pervious.
Fine, certainly. I think coastal engineering structures we've talked about numerous times. I don't know what you guys are thinking as far as extra information to get.
I'd like to look at pools, looking at kind of more of a streamlined protocol for work that's considers only invasive species removal, and also looking at use by private organizations who open up their land to the public, and also getting into the enforcement, looking a little bit more into the penalties again.
I wonder, do we want to have any kind of special provisions for handicap accessibility, since that often would require more, just kind of like at Jetty's Beach, it requires a more structural element often to have handicap accessibility than just a path through the sand, for example, or things like that. I know the land bank has come in for several projects where they want to get handicap accessibility down to the water's edge and things, but typically they meet the performance standards in general.
Right.
Yes, so that's something we've been thinking a lot about for this idea of public use and public lands, and I think we tend to agree that ADA access keeps coming up a lot, and how to deal with that. I think the one thing that we want to be really careful about how we view that is, you know, you don't want to set up a condition, and I know this is going to sound terrible to say it, where people are starting coming in and saying, well, I'm building a handicap access.
Right.
And it's something where
Yeah.
you don't want people to try to use that as a loophole. I know that sounds awful to say, because there are definitely cases where it's clearly needed and clearly warranted. But I also know that if people find a way to do it, to say, well, that's for this use, I think that's something that would have to be vetted very carefully to do, or to have really strict standards for what qualifies for that, without getting into, I mean, we actually have to stay kind of within our interests and things like that, and I mean, you can get into ADA access through recreation a bit, but I think that's something we'd have to be very careful about. That could be like a Pandora's box of Pandora's boxes to get into.
Jeff, question, is there any way to get better habitat review?
In what regards?
Just on our projects, just locally. You know, like I don't know if it would go in the regulation rewrite. Like natural heritage just doesn't, I feel like, always thoroughly review local projects, and I feel like that is kind of a hole, but I don't know if it's something we can.
I think it is. I mean, I think that's a process in and of itself to talk about jurisdictional habitat reviews and doing a different kind of assessment as it relates to wildlife habitats. I mean, I think that certainly something that could be developed over time. I mean, I think honestly that's something that if we were going to go down that path, we would probably want to tap into a resource like NBI and partner up with some of the other local groups to really talk about really specific Nantucket habitats and, you know, what makes a higher quality habitat or lower quality habitat, or what that would be and how we wanted to rate that separately. I think it would be worthwhile to do if done correctly, but I also think that a time frame for developing a program of that nature would probably be longer than what we'd be looking at for these regs. That being said, I'm not trying to say let's not do it, because I think there's a lot of good work that's going on that kind of gets to that already on island. I think it's just a matter of developing what that would be through our regulations and how that would function, because I think a lot of, like I said, I think a lot of that information's there, but it's, you have to set up a process that's still available enough to the public to understand and do. And that's a little bit where the trick is. And I think that's where honestly a lot of the frustration with Heritage deals with is it's very much a, we know all the information and we don't want to tell anyone the information. And you get stuck in this vicious cycle of, well, you tell us what you want to do and then we'll tell you what you have to do to be in compliance. And then people at the end go, well, I don't understand why you're imposing these conditions on me. You need to set it up better so people understand why it's important. I think that's, it'd be really cool though.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is great, but it doesn't seem extremely logistically feasible, at least in the short term. What would happen probably would be a GIS exercise where researchers requested data from natural heritage already that they have, and then ground truth it based on what the local conditions say in terms of change over time. But heritage, in giving out that data, would condition that it can't be released to the public.
Yeah.
So that resource wouldn't be a regulatory resource that we could actually use.
So maybe it's just the future, long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that if you really set off to do, and you know, we're willing to spend part of like the next like 5 years kind of figuring out what that would look like, you could probably get something that was pretty worthwhile.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly believe, and I think some of the more interesting work on that on island is stuff that's really being done by Jenna, NCF, and Sarah at Linda Loring, where they've really started to look at classifying areas differently and identifying higher and lower priority areas for conservation based upon kind of habitat typing and habitat values. That's a really, really round discussion of what they kind of look at. But if you had a system like that, it'd be kind of interesting. But the easier part for them is they're looking at, you know, through a GIS exercise, kind of the area as a whole, where our focus is very much narrowed by buffer zones and by wetlands. I mean, you guys do have the ability to kind of contemplate open space through enabling legislation, but it's not something where you have regulatory standards that have been adopted for the commission to regulate open space to this point, outside of wetland buffer zones. But yeah, I think it's a developing field. It's pretty interesting. So
I agree. I mean, even what you're talking about with the project that Jen and Sarah have done or are doing, they have classified information from heritage as part of that project, which is great. But in order to use that for our commission, we would need to get information that is public data.
Yeah.
So, not feasible for these regs, but something.
No, but I don't think it's something that's worth just disappearing into the ether and never talking about it again. And it may be something that over time you look at. I mean, we take in a lot of data just from bordering vegetated wetlands, where there's a lot of data form comes in, where you get some level of vegetative survey that's coming in. And if there was some repository where you were kind of mapping areas based upon those data forms that were coming in, I think you could get some really interesting information about, you know, what the buffer zones really are looking like and can kind of see. And I mean, most of the guys that go out there also, I mean, identify wildlife or see things that are there, or we know enough about most of the animals on Nantucket for what habitats they prefer, that if you're seeing some of those areas, you can kind of apply those together and talk about them that way. So there is some opportunity there to kind of do a similar thing without, you know, getting into the natural heritage web. So
yeah, I mean, we could stack the wetland boundaries that we know exist versus the landscape plot, the plot plan, and then we could look at any data that we have in terms of projects that have come in for wildlife or plant resources, and we could eventually stack those together to start to create a map.
Yeah,
it's just going to take a while of compiling all the resources.
I mean, I'll be honest, a dream of mine for years, and not to bore everyone in the room, I would love to start, especially now that we're switching into getting plans digitally and digital submissions, be able to have a big enough GIS department to import real wetland lines by map and parcel into the GIS to update our really rough GIS wetland mapping. That's, I don't want to say really inaccurate most of the time, but has some inaccuracies to it. And as you get parcels, be able to add those in, so when people are looking at the resource, there's a chance where they may be actually seeing a approved wetland line and an actual delineation, and not someone sitting down with the aerial photograph and saying, well, I think I see the vegetative break and topographic break here, and trying their best. Like, I mean, these guys are all going out, and the surveyors are all putting together these much more accurate depictions to be able to get that as a data layer for people to use. Would be nice. At the same time, don't want to take business away from the surveyors for going out and locating lines and doing things, but to use it more as a resource, I think would be helpful, because there's a lot of wetlands that don't even appear on the GIS that are really real. So
could we request that any applications that come in, they submit those lines digitally as a GIS file to the commission?
We've talked about that with our GIS guy. I think we're a little bit away from their end to do that, but it is something that we've been talking about, because we get so much information now, and most of the stuff comes in via PDF. To get that, obviously those guys also, you know, are cautious, because if they're stamping a plan, their license is involved, and getting that set up and making sure that it's legal. So if you get a shape file, that it's not impacting their license or dealing with it. But I mean, I think it'd be awesome to be able to get septics and wetlands and things kind of all put together, so you can really see it and interact with it. And I think we're headed there, but I think that one's a little bit a ways still.
The majority of projects we're talking to the town guy now on almost everything anyway.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it's not.
Yeah, if that's what you're.
Not a lot of work to do, because most of them we're doing that anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
It's just kind of catching up some of the legal end stuff on it too.
Sure.
But I'm hopeful in the next like 3 or 4 years we'll be doing a lot of that data integration from all of the work that's getting done. It'd be nice. Got to keep Paul busy, you know.
I'll comment on the regulations, though, if I could just, and I did talk to Jeff about this too, maybe if there's, and I don't know if this can be done even through the state act or not, but maybe streamlining certain projects, so there'd almost be an administrative approval for some projects. So if homeowner wants to put a deck on, it's within the 100, there's no change to grade, you know, rather than filing a full notice of intent or an IBA coming before you, that's something that can be done as an administrative approval through staff. You'd still have an administrative approval component of your agenda that Jeff may say, listen, so-and-so's adding a deck, it's in the 100, we've reviewed it. Yeah, it's good. And then I think it might streamline the amount of applications that you have before you. And then, again, I don't know if it can be done.
The state, so to like skip the RDA.
I know there was talk years ago at the state level of providing some type of administrative approval. But I know that didn't go anywhere.
So the state act does allow for, there is a group of minor activities that they allow for that doesn't necessarily require a notice of intent, and there's very specific things. So as an example, a pedestrian walkway of less than, I want to say, on private property, it's less than 2 feet and is essentially unimproved. So if you mow a grass path outside of a certain buffer zone, you don't need to necessarily have a permit through the state act to do that anymore. If it's a public property, I believe it's 3 feet and has to be pervious, and you can essentially do some of that work outside of resource areas. Like, you can't just blaze trails through wetlands, but if you're outside, I believe, I have to look at the exact language, but I think if you're outside of the 50, that's something that they're not necessarily requiring a state notice of intent to do anymore. And there's a list, there's like 5 or 6, but they have very specific requirements. So can provide those to you and mine those out of the act, because it's over like 3 pages with like 2 blank pages, and it's kind of annoying to read through. So so that is something that they've started to do. So I'll just add that to our list, and I'll try to compile that together, and you guys can talk about that. Yeah, I do know, just to add into Paul, the land bank has kind of approached about some similar things. There's mostly relates to being able to install like wooden posts or fencing to prevent car parking or people damaging their property, and being able to be responsive to that without having to file a full notice of intent for areas that are just buffer zone activities. We've been pretty good in just saying, hey, and I'll use Hallowell Lane as the example, where people were slowly mining into their buffer zone by parking across the street from their lots, and they said, we want to stop it, but we don't want to wait the 60 days to do a notice of intent to stop the activity. So we ended up just issuing them an enforcement saying, you guys are damaging the buffer zone by parking cars and moving farther and farther, and you guys need to just block off that area. And they ended up just clunking a bunch of rocks down to do it. By the letter of the law, probably should have required a full filing to do. In the immediacy of the situation, doing it via enforcement and saying, you guys can't go into the buffer zone anymore there, it's just not allowed, was effectively what happened and kind of ended the problem. I think they would like to feel better about doing it outside of the enforcement process, but doing it that way. And then they also, and I told Rachel I'd add it in there, they also, through regulations, want to talk to the commission about viewshed management a little bit. So, and having some sort of standards for what that could be or what that couldn't be. I told them they
know what it can't be.
Well,
yeah,
I told them they needed to put pen to paper and figure out what they were kind of looking to do. But I think right now our performance standards are kind of lacking for activities like that. They don't even really say you can't do it or you can or what it is. I think they would just like some more clear guidance. So I said, if you guys have suggestions, well, it's open. You can provide the commission information to review, and we can take it up from there. So just to warn you that that's probably coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think that topic is relevant not just for the land bank, but for other conservation organizations who have a similar, MO, where they may even be a private organization, but they're accessible to the public, act as like a quasi-public organization. We can have that discussion.
Yeah, because I think some have management plans that would provide for some of that cutting.
Some do,
right.
some don't.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll be the first to admit, and I think anyone that would go out on things, and really the kind of what prompted the discussion that I had with Rachel was, I don't think there's any question that most coastal properties do some level of viewshed management, and some are more aggressive than others, and a lot of it is probably in the 0 to 25 and has historically been done in there. And it, depending on the time of the year, you can go and plants are 4 feet high, or sometimes the year the plants are like 6 inches high, and setting up standards for what is acceptable, or finding ways to encourage people to, if they're going to have managed areas, to select species that are better choices for those areas than ones that require that. I know we've talked to people before about, hey, you're going to be in that coastal area and you guys want to maintain your view, and it's lawn right now, that making choices like huckleberry and things that stay pretty low are a vastly better choice, because you're not having to maintain it and it's staying kind of in the character that you want, and it's providing a better level of habitat value than you guys growing Rosa rugosa and whacking it down to 4 inches every winter and then letting it grow back up through the summer and then cutting it back down. That it's trying to enable people with the tools to do it better. I think was the message I was trying to suggest to them, that they look at it from that lens. It's like, how can we make
Jeff, I think that
better?
is a terrific idea, because it's really, giving guidance to people as opposed to, slapping them on the hand or, whatever. I mean, it's that we can make it better, not just legal or what have you. And I think that really makes sense. I'm afraid I need to bow off the call now. Do we have anything left to vote on?
No, I think we're good.
It's just reports and things.
Okay. I'm sorry. We've just arrived in Monterey, and so we need to get kind of settled here. So I'm sorry. I apologize to everybody.
We're just on
Have
foggy
fun.
Nantucket. It's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks
All right.
very much.
Yep.
Bye,
Bye.
Bye-bye.
But beyond a guidance, which I think is great, do we have the jurisdiction to condition which plants can and cannot be planted? Or is
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
So we do it a lot, and I know we've recently been on a kind of a 2-year quest of removing like cultivars from with inside jurisdiction and things that are there. You guys absolutely have the right to condition plants within buffer zones that are going in. So
specific. So like, say there's a specific line, we can say in this specific area we need this plant.
yeah, I mean, there's.
Within reason.
I think giving, you obviously have to give people some level of choice to some degree, but just kind of as an example, and we've said it for a long time, that if you're doing replantings in that 0 to 25 zone, or more importantly, even in resource areas, that it's all natives, no cultivars, and then even looking at the planting list and saying that's appropriate or that's inappropriate to have in. I mean, it can go to that level. I mean, I think equipping people with a few choices for areas is better for people to understand why it's important, and they have a little bit. But to say, hey, this is an area where these 5 or 6 shrubs would be really great to put in there, and then you could mix in these things with it, and having kind of a choice through there, and it would be completely appropriate to do, and they go together. It's certainly something that's within purview to do.
Yeah, that's what I know. I've seen the commission say we need a planting plan of natives in the past, but I was just wondering if we could say we need exactly this plant, or is it just kind of up to the?
It's a little looser than
Okay,
that.
sure.
Like here are the coastal species listed, or usually they would give us a list of what was on site anyway, and then they'd be trying to match those species and add in others.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to the list? It's a pretty good list to get started.
Yeah, I think it's solid.
All right, I have a few that I want to add to the list. So, just because I think it'd be good, and we obviously get to talk to a lot of people, so sometimes we think about these things. I think we've covered some of the big ones. I think we really like to have a discussion where we're incentivizing bioretention to deal with impervious surface runoff, and incentivizing that in some way to be bought into. We've had lots of kind of weird abstract ideas with that. We were talking just today, not to pick on, we were talking about one of the ones we discussed today that was asking for a waiver to 2-foot separation of groundwater, and dealing with some fairly, just in square footage wise, a fair amount of impervious surface area that was coming in, and we're just kind of kicking it around and thinking of it in a sense of how are you going to deal with the water from that impervious surface, and how are you going to get it to the wetland where it's ultimately going to go anyways, but in the best manner possible. And I think what we were really thinking about was, especially for new development, something where you're creating a situation where you're kind of requiring some level of infiltration with a separation to groundwater that's non-waivable, with the exception of if you can't meet the required separation, you have to use a bioretention option, that, and then just set standards for what that would look like. So, whether it's shrubs or trees or whatever it would be, you can give people choices in there, but it's something to say, if we set that minimum distance for infiltration to be 4 feet to groundwater for impervious surface runoff, if you can't make that, well, then you got to bioretain it. And it's got to infiltrate in that way to get a little extra. But I think we're hoping to take a little bit more of an aggressive stab at it, because it's something where we see a lot of projects come in, and Brant Point's always the neighborhood that sticks in my mind, where it's well, we're going to put, we're going to put like a little holding chamber in, and you look at it and the surface elevation is 3.5, and you're going, well, if it's 3.5, and I know those have to be at least a foot below the ground, so now you're at 2.5, and groundwater is at, isn't there like, well, you're sitting these chambers kind of in the groundwater, and that's not an effective way to infiltrate, and you're not getting any treatment to it, right? You're not getting any of the benefits of having to percolate through soil or deal with it or get it onto plants or dealing something. So that would be a situation to say, well, maybe you guys should figure out that area and address it through a better way. And this is a better way, and it kind of encourages more green areas and using plants that are smarter choices and not doing it. So yeah, and I think that's,
we're working with the Philadelphia Water Department. I mean, all public buildings and private businesses have to infiltrate the first inch per hour. They get taxed pretty heavily. So
yeah, I'm not sure we're ready for a tax, but I think,
it really created an avenue for green roofs, stormwater planters, bioswales. I mean, all of that stuff.
But I think that's something, and also having, because we've had issues with them before, where moving away from, and I'll pick on planning, country style drainage, where it's hey, that's a nice little grassy swale, and then the water goes into, and then it's full of grass, and they are just wonderful to say, well, that's not good enough. Those plants aren't good enough. You need to do better. And I think having some real, whether it's best management practices for bioretention or something, but I really think that, we're kind of moving into an era where, especially for new development from scratch, we should be saying, you just have to do it. There's not a choice, right? It's great that you can let it just go overland flow and deal with it, but you have all these things that are impacting it, and you're with groundwater or 2-foot separation of groundwater. These are the standards. You have to deal with it correctly, and giving people the tools to do it. And I know it's probably going to get pushed back at times, but that's one area that we want to kind of get some information together and really talk about, because I think it's going to be important, and if it's within kind of town water quality goals, and we're talking about crafting a stormwater bylaw, and it's going to come up a lot, is what are we going to do with stormwater? And a lot of these neighborhoods don't have a municipal system to rely on, or even private systems that are functioning correctly to rely on, to say, here's a really excellent choice. It may not, you still may be able to do traditional infiltration in spots, but this is another tool for you guys to use, and this is how you can do it. So that was one. I think we covered most of the rest of them. We have some thoughts on
just getting back to bioretention for a second. I think it's a great idea, and I think the minimum distance to groundwater makes sense. I think there's a few other things we might want to look at, like square footage of the proposed structure, either by the actual amount or by a percentage, something like that, because they might meet the groundwater requirements, but if they're putting so much impervious surface on the site, then bioretention is a good idea.
Yeah, as much as I hate to say it, is I always hate to lean towards over engineering, but I think you'd have to look at it a lot like how we look at roadway design and things, where you're sizing things appropriate to specific rainfall events, and kind of calculating what that volume would be based upon the impervious surface. And I don't think we have to get as detailed as having runoff coefficients for forest is this and grass is this. Engineering does, but I think if we at least have an idea of, hey, if you have 2,000 square feet of impervious surface and we want you to be able to deal with your first inch per hour, you can figure out a pretty rough volume and say, you had to hold it. That's just what you have to do. That's the minimum standard, and make it simple. But again, I think reinforcing the importance of that and having done correctly, and it's something that I think that's kind of the nice part about regulations too, is they take a public hearing to amend or change. So if it's something that we feel that even a year later, there needs to be a tweak to it or a correction can be done, or even the board as they're reviewing projects can discuss that and can condition in and around that discussion to make sure that it's still working correctly. So you guys get a lot of leeway for things. We just don't always exercise it. So some of it's just because we don't have standards in place to really do it. That was one. I don't think I had another one in my head. I kind of want to tackle that separation to groundwater as far as the requirements to apply for a waiver to that. Yep. Because it's something that I know I will actually say my name is on the notice of intent for the project that started that whole discussion. So I apologize. But it was in Squam, and it was a house where they built an impervious foundation that recycles water. Engineer designed it, was the one standing here, and it collects water from foundation drains and pumps it up to an infiltration bed further up the site, and then the groundwater flow brings the water right back down. But it runs continuously. But that's a project in Squam, and it's something that I kind of understood the genesis of it and kind of participated in. You had to have just come on the board right after that was adopted.
It was afterwards, because I remember hearing about that one, but I wasn't on the board then.
No, it was right before, but it's something where the standard was put in, and I think the standard was put in for very good reason, but the waiver has always been given. No one has ever been denied that waiver, and no one has really ever tackled, well, you have the standard that you clearly don't have to meet because you just say, well, I want the separation of groundwater waiver, and here you go, is I think really buckling down for real requirements to get that. So you can do a lot of things with it. I mean, you could have very specific, it's only granted for certain situations, or you have to demonstrate this, or you have to provide this, or I mean, I think dealing with that better than just fill out the piece of paper that asks for the waiver and go on your way is something that we'd like to do. And that gets that. I don't think I had anything else. I know we talked to Ian. Ian would also like to go through and discuss, related to coastal engineering structures, he would like to really discuss the pre-78 qualification. So. And how that looks. So I think that's it for now. It's a pretty long list, so we'll be busy.
We'll probably come up with more as we go too.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is just stuff, like I said, I think we want to try to get to look through and see how a lot of other spots are regulating. Massachusetts is kind of behind the times in regulating pools. There are a lot of other states that do it better. Like California regulates pools pretty aggressively. And some communities down south as well, where they've had kind of a big influx of pools and how they deal with it. So there's a lot of really good information about that kind of stuff. And some of these other things are definitely been contemplated in a lot of other spots. I mean, it actually brings up, like, Philadelphia is definitely ahead of the curve as far as bioretention areas and green space and runoff management and some of those things. So I don't think we're looking to invent anything or get crazy, but
there's some good things.
There's lots of good things to look at.
Alright. That sounds
Well,
good.
maybe they have a good list of what kind of plants to use in.
Oh, they have lots of different lists and resources. It's Green Cities Clean Water is their website.
Yeah.
But like great ideas for any different site conditions. Oh, you don't have space, so use this instead.
Yeah, and honestly too, the brochure we hand out the most is probably NBI's, and I always get the name wrong, but it's essentially their landscaping brochure.
Native plant guide.
Yeah, their native plant guide, where they list, this is good in this situation, this is good in this situation, this is a good replacement for these things. I think that's a really good starting space for us to go with. So I think that is helpful. Like I said, we have a lot of really awesome resources on Island for stuff like this too. Like if we talk about invasives, you know, bringing people like Kelly from NCF back to talk about it, bringing some folks from off island. I mean, I think, again, none of these topics are new. But there's lots of people that know a lot more than all of us do about these things that can really provide really good guidance.
Right, so that sounds good, and we'll nail down dates later.
Yeah, I think right now we'll probably just keep this on the agenda in just other business for a bit, just so it kind of stays relevant. And then we'll try to get people information as we can, and then if people think of other topics, and then I think, you know, probably the next month or so, we'll really sit down and talk about kind of where we're headed, and then can schedule a public hearing from there. Because we can't really discuss direct changes
Right, until
without the public hearing, but compiling information and knowing kind of where we're headed. And I think at least maybe even getting kind of some draft language together in advance of that, and then advertising it is something that would probably provide a more informed discussion than, well, I think this, let's just take a stab at it. So if anyone comes across anything, like I said, related to any of those or has information they want to share, just send it to us in the office and we can distribute it around. We'll probably try to keep it topic related, kind of group stuff together. And I think we're talking about creating kind of a web resource like the regular packet where we can just post stuff into different topics. So everyone can see it and the public can get it. And, you know, if the land council has submissions they want to put in, or land bank, or one of the surveyors, or someone that's there, it's something that everyone can see. So everyone has the same information and what we're talking about.
Sounds good.
Trying to minimize complaints.
All right, so we'll move on to reports. Crack.
First meeting's a week from today.
Okay.
Oh, a week from yesterday. It's Tuesday.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Very good.
A week from yesterday.
Week from yesterday. 6 days from today.
CPC, not here. NP and EDC, not here. Mosquito control, not happening. Commissioners' comments? None?
None.
Sounds good. Administrator staff reports?
I think that's it.
Oh, State of the Harbor tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, what, you want to just tell us about that quick?
Yeah, so third annual State of the Harbor at Great Harbor Yacht Club. And we have Thais is going to be there. Jeffries, are you speaking?
I will be.
Yeah. Leah's going to actually do a presentation about Leah Cabral on the state of shellfish in the harbor. There's going to be a lot of water quality stuff. There's going to be Q&A afterward.
When does it start?
Awesome. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, meeting over.
Thank you. Again.
Not bad. 2 hours almost on the nose.
Yeah, not too
Look,
bad.
there's some extended discussions even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley.
Somebody give me a ride back